In Hulu's adaptation of The Handmaid's Tale, it starts with the laying off of all women from their jobs. Then their bank accounts are frozen, and ultimately they are stripped of citizenship, rights, and freedom, categorized by their ability to reproduce or not, and funneled into forced servitude of one horrible kind or another. Women are the targets of Margaret Atwood's dystopian America, of the state-sponsored domination and violence. And though everyone I know who watched it felt sick with how easily that could become our reality, it's still a fictional world. It's a figment of Atwood's imagination. But of course, that level of state-sponsored brutality and discrimination has already happened, has already been someone's reality. In Germany in the 1930s, the state passed law after law to isolate, disenfranchise, and break down Jewish Germans. It is shocking how easily the German parliamentary government chipped away at Jewish citizenship, attacking the livelihoods and cultural contributions of small groups of Jews before finally passing the series of laws known as the Nuremberg Laws, which stripped Jews of their citizenship, rights, and in the end, their freedom. And so on January 30th, 1933, Hindenburg appointed Adolf Hitler, leader of the NSDAP, as chancellor. This deal was made in a back room, as a group of conservative politicians believed that with the popular Hitler in power, they could begin dismantling the parliamentary system themselves and turn Germany back into a conservative authoritarian regime. They were only partially wrong, of course, because Hitler and the Nazis outmaneuvered them and quickly turned Germany into a Nazi state.
At the end of February 1933, the Nazi leaders falsely claimed that a fire at the Reichstag building was an attempted communist coup. This allowed Hitler to decree a state of emergency, a suspension of parliamentary activity, and the granting of emergency powers to the chancellor. Within a few months, the Nazis controlled cultural institutions, education, the economy, and lawmaking. They also received support from the majority of Protestant and Catholic clergymen in Germany. In this early period, the Nazi leadership quickly passed a handful of laws that would begin the systematic persecution of German Jews.
1938 sent Nazi youths and agents into Jewish communities to destroy Jewish businesses and attack Jewish Germans in the night of broken glass, or Kristallnacht. Anti-Semitic laws were passed as early as March 1933. Laws targeting the Jewish middle class were first.
In April 1933, the law for the reestablishment of a professional civil service went into effect, allowing for the immediate dismissal of civil servants on political grounds and for the compulsory retirement of civil servants, quote, not of Aryan descent, end quote. A similar law affected Jewish lawyers. Though these early legal statutes were mitigated slightly by the other political players like President Hindenburg, who was not yet supplanted by Adolf Hitler, they represent a steady march toward the Nazi goal of a racial state. Nazi leadership sought to remove Jews from all elements of German professional life, to prevent Jews from attending university, the law against the overcrowding of German schools and universities, and to prevent Jewish doctors, dentists, patent lawyers, and accountants from practicing.
The new Nazi state also implemented measures to eradicate Jews from cultural and intellectual life. Concerts and theater performances with Jewish musicians and actors were disrupted, and Jewish artists were dismissed from their jobs and commissions. As Hitler explained, quote, the immediate eradication of the excess of Jewish intellectuals from the cultural and intellectual life of Germany is necessary if justice is to be done to Germany's natural right to an intellectual leadership appropriate to its own kind. End quote. People abroad were complaining, above all, about the legalized treatment of the Jews as second-class citizens. End quote.
Führerprinzip. Is that how you say it?
Sure.
Nazi foreign policy hinged on a belief that Germans were the superior European race, destined to conquer Eastern Europe and carve out additional living space for the Aryan race. Domestic policy focused on the elimination of racially inferior peoples, particularly Jews, but also people with disabilities, the Roma and the Shinti Gypsies, and political enemies and dissidents. Excising these undesirables was of utmost importance to national security.
Race and genetics were always a top concern to ranking Nazis. We find the same concern exhibited by America's ruling families. By the time of his death in 1937, John D. Rockefeller and his only son, John D. Rockefeller Jr., had not only built up an amazing oil empire, but had established such institutions as the University of Chicago, 1889, the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research, 1901, later renamed Rockefeller University. In New York City, the General Education Board, 1903, the Rockefeller Foundation, 1913, and the Lincoln School, 1917, where the Rockefeller siblings began their education. These Rockefeller-funded institutions ensured their early entry into the fields of medicine, pharmaceuticals, and education. The Rockefellers were also interested in the eugenics movement, a program of scientifically applied genetic selection to maintain and improve their ideal for human characteristics, which included birth and population control. One of the leading and articulate authorities behind the rationale for this act was Dr. Ernst Rudin, a psychiatrist who in 1930 had traveled to Washington, D.C. to present a paper called The Importance of Eugenics and Genetics in Mental Hygiene. It was well received by those present, as many Americans, especially among the globalists, had come to embrace the racist and elitist views of the German philosophers. Nazi interest in science and psychological warfare was paralleled by their concern with eugenics, the scientific study of selective breeding to improve the human population.
The eugenic ideology of the Third Reich was evidenced most prominently in the Law for the Protection of Hereditary Health and the Blood and Honor Law. The Hereditary Health Law specifically outlined mental and physical disabilities that were to be targeted for removal from the Volk, or people, German people's, gene pool.
Leading the movement to eliminate mental defectives from the German population were lawyer Karl Binding and the psychiatrist Alfred Hoch, who popularized the chilling phrase lebensunwertes Leben, or life unworthy of life. In a 1920 tract titled Die Freigabe der Vernichtung lebensunwerten Lebens, or Lifting Controls on the Destruction of Life Unworthy of Life, this text, arguably more than any other, made available to the Nazi regime an ethical rationale for euthanasia, although in the early days of the regime the public discussion would focus on the prevention of offspring with hereditary disease, hence sterilization. The destruction of life unworthy of life would spread as an unspoken principle. Since no one has yet found a significant and general cure for insanity, psychiatrists turned to the dubious concept of prevention. This came to be known as mental hygiene, a bland term for the prevention of mental illness, whatever form that might take. In the Germany of the 1930s, the rush to isolate and cure mental defectives quickly was interpreted to include malcontents and dissidents opposed to the Nazi regime. This open-ended concept resulted in the Nazi Sterilization Act, which went into effect in July 1933, just 6 months after Hitler's ascension to power.
This law allowed the government to tag undesirables for forced sterilization, and then later that would be sort of the legal precedent for euthanasia. Anyone who suffered from a, quote, inheritable disease could be surgically sterilized if a doctor deemed it necessary to prevent descendants from inheriting mental or physical, quote unquote, defects.
The list of undesirable inheritable diseases, I'm going to go down the list right now. There's 8 of them. Congenital feeble-mindedness, schizophrenia, manic depression, congenital epilepsy, inheritable St. Vitus dance, Huntington's chorea, hereditary blindness, hereditary deafness, and serious inheritable malformations. And a separate bullet in the law, those subject to forced sterilization also included, quote, anyone suffering from chronic alcoholism, end quote.
So essentially this list is a combination of new scientific medical diagnoses and then also sort of made up things. Doctors, as well as officials in charge of hospitals, sanitariums, and prisons, could also recommend that an individual be forcibly sterilized at any time. This law was used extensively on patients in hospitals and asylums, on those deemed mentally or physically unfit to potentially reproduce. Men, women, and children were taken into unnecessary and non-consensual surgeries for tube tying and vasectomies. These operations were, of course, performed by many doctors who believed as much in racial hierarchies and eugenic principles as the highest Nazi official. Whenever I talk about or learn about or teach about the Holocaust, I am devastated over and over again by what people can justify doing to other people.
John Cornwell, in his 2003 book Hitler's Scientists, Science, War and the Devil's Pact, The Chosen Means of Prevention and Forced Sterilization was administered by special hereditary health courts, made up of 2 doctors, usually psychiatrists, and 1 civil official, usually a judge close to the Nazi Party, who acted as chairman. The Nazi euthanasia program was not carried out in the open, but instead by secret decrees, as Hitler steadfastly refused to seek a legal ruling, knowing that such a program was illegal under existing laws. It is estimated that more than 400,000 people were sterilized as life unworthy of life between 1934 and 1945. The projected total of 410,000 was considered only preliminary, drawn mostly from people already in institutions. It was assumed that much greater numbers of people would eventually be identified and sterilized, stated Robert J. Lifton in The Nazi Doctors, Medical Killing and the Psychology of Genocide. Lifton went on, not surprisingly, Fritz Lenz, whose eugenics work was parroted by Hitler, carried the concept farthest in suggesting the advisability of sterilizing people with only slight signs of mental disease, though he recognized that a radical application of this principle would lead to the sterilization of 20% of the total German population, something on the order of 20 million people. During the war, as today, both medical doctors and psychiatrists were quite vulnerable to peer pressure, as well as the goodwill of the state, which provided the credentials and certificates necessary for their practice. So it seemed natural that mind manipulation through psychiatry and psychology was soon joined by a companion therapy, drugs. German psychiatrists were merely following the lead of medical doctors, who in the 20th century increasingly moved away from the tradition of homeopathy, which involved using minimal doses of drugs as therapy, to allopathy, the straightforward treatment of disease with drugs. What therapy could not accomplish through psychological means might be accomplished through drugs. This trend to increase the use of prescription drugs set the stage for the rise of the giant pharmaceutical corporations during the 20th century. During the time of the Opium Wars of the late 1800s, any type of drug was used for profit. For example, in 1898, the German Bayer Company began mass production of heroin, diacetylmorphine, and used that name to market the new remedy. Bayer described heroin as non-addictive panacea for adult ailments and infant respiratory diseases. In the late 1800s, Bayer also promoted cocaine, which until the 1920s was an ingredient in the soft drink Coca-Cola. But as more easily produced petrochemical drugs made their debut, they promoted the attention of the major global corporations. The Rockefeller family's interest in pharmaceuticals reaches back to the days of John Dee's father, William Big Bill Rockefeller, who sold rock oil, a diuretic medicine that guaranteed all cases of cancer cured unless they are too far gone. William Rockefeller's original miracle oil survived until quite recently as a concoction called Nujol, consisting principally of petroleum and peddled as a laxative, wrote Eustace Mullins. Nujol was manufactured by a subsidiary of Standard Oil of New Jersey, called Stanco, whose only other product manufactured on the same premises was the famous insecticide Flit. Rockefeller's General Education Board has spent more than $100 million to gain control of the nation's medical schools and turn our physicians to physicians of the allopathic school, dedicated to surgery and the heavy use of drugs, commented Mullins, adding, America became the greatest and most productive nation in the world because we had the healthiest citizens in the world. When the Rockefeller Syndicate began its takeover of our medical profession in 1910, our citizens went into sharp decline. Today we suffer from a host of debilitating ailments, both mental and physical, nearly all of which can be traced directly to the operations of the chemical and drug monopoly, and which pose the greatest threat to our continued existence as a nation. Another aspect of Nazi medical science employed in America involves the toxic chemical sodium fluoride. The controversy over the fluoridation of municipal water supplies has raged since the 1950s and continues today. Aluminium oxide is extracted from clay and bauxite through a chemical called cryolite. The material is converted into aluminium. A byproduct of this process is sodium fluoride, which for many years was used as a rat poison. One recent dictionary defined fluoride as a poisonous pale yellow gaseous element of the halogen group, Sodium fluoride also acts as an enzyme inhibitor and has been linked by several studies, such as a 1982 report from the University of Iowa. The Alzheimer's disease, a degenerative and fatal neural disease named for the German Dr. Alois Alzheimer. According to the Alzheimer Association, this brain-destroying disease is the 7th leading cause of death in America today. A March 2006 National Academy of Sciences National Research Council report identified fluoride as a potent hormone disruptor that may affect normal thyroid function. The NIS-NRC report also cited concerns about the potential of fluoride to lower IQ, noting that the consistency of study results appears significant enough to warrant additional research on the effects of fluoride on intelligence. That finding was echoed by a December 2006 study published in the prestigious peer-reviewed journal The Lancet, which identified fluoride as an emerging neurotoxin, and a 2006 peer-reviewed study at Harvard strongly supported concerns that fluoridated water is linked to osteosarcoma, an often fatal form of bone cancer, in boys. Brain studies reported by the Alzheimer's Society in England show that aluminium accumulates in nerve cells that are particularly vulnerable to Alzheimer's disease, although not all persons exposed to aluminium develop Alzheimer's. Although many studies on animals and on isolated cells have shown that aluminium has toxic effects on the nervous system, it is claimed that the doses of aluminium used were much higher than those occurring naturally in tissues. This obviously raises the question of how much fluoride aluminium the public is ingesting from non-natural sources, such as the fluoridation of drinking water. Numerous websites and periodicals have carried the accusation that sodium fluoride was placed in the drinking water of Nazi concentration camps to keep inmates pacified and susceptible to external control. Such use of fluoridation by the Nazis to dull the senses of prisoners was prescribed by Charles Eliot Perkins, a prominent U.S. industrial chemist, who the U.S. government sent to help reconstruct the IG Farben chemical plants in Germany at the end of the war. In a 1954 letter to the Lee Foundation for Nutritional Research, Perkins stated, "The German chemists worked out a very ingenious and far-reaching plan of mass control that was submitted to and adopted by the German General Staff. This plan was to control the population of any given era through mass medication of drinking water supplies." Rockefeller agents order fluoride rat poisoning of nation's water. Water fluoridation is the most important aspect of the Cold War that is being waged on us, chemically, from within, by the Rockefeller-Soviet axis. It serves to blunt the intelligence of a people in a manner that no other dope can. Also, it is genocidal in two manners. It causes chemical castration and it causes cancer, thus killing off older folks. This committee, Ewing's study of fluoride, did no research or investigation on the poisonous effects of water fluoridation. They accepted the falsified data published by the USPHS, U.S. Public Health Service, on the order of boss Oscar Ewing, who had been rewarded with $700,000 by fluoride waste producer Aluminium. The real purpose behind water fluoridation is to reduce the resistance of the masses to domination and control and loss of liberty. Repeated doses of infinitesimal amounts of fluorine will in time gradually reduce the individual's power to resist domination by slowly poisoning and narcotizing this area of brain tissue, and make him submissive to the will of those who wish to govern him. I was told of this entire scheme by a German chemist who was an official of the great Farben chemical industries and was prominent in the Nazi movement at the time. I say this with all the earnestness and sincerity of a scientist who has spent nearly 20 years' research into the chemistry, biochemistry, physiology and pathology of fluorine. It is interesting to note that West Germany banned the use of fluorides in 1971, a time when it was still heavily occupied by Allied soldiers. Apparently, they could no longer silence the German scientists who had proved that fluoridation is a deadly threat to the population, wrote Mullins. Sweden followed West Germany in banning fluoridation, and the Netherlands officially banned it on June 22, 1973, by order of their highest court. But the scientific minds encouraged by globalist funding were not content with drugs to merely pacify a population. They wanted direct control. It should come as no surprise that the men behind the documented CIA mind control projects MKUltra, Artichoke, Bluebird, MK Delta, etc. had received Nazi medical science passed along by paperclip doctors and their proteges. The infusion of Nazi mind control specialists within the fledgling CIA resulted in Project MKUltra, a codename for mind control research that continued until the late 1960s, when it was said to have been discontinued. Project MKUltra was created in 1953 by CIA officer Richard Helms, a good friend to CIA psychiatrist Dr. Sidney Gottlieb. It was the brainchild of the CIA director Allen Dulles. Dulles reportedly was intrigued by reports of mind control techniques, allegedly conducted by Soviet, Chinese, and North Korean on US prisoners during the Korean War. Published accounts show this project not only used drugs to manipulate a person's personality, but also electronic signals to alter brain function. Most people do not realize that fluoride is a key ingredient in Prozac and many other psychotropic drugs. Prozac, whose scientific name is Fluoxetine, is 94% fluoride. more than 21 million prescriptions for fluoxetine were filled in the United States in 2006, making it one of the most prescribed antidepressants. Every U.S. Public Health Service Surgeon General from the 1950s to this day has supported the introduction of this poison into America's water supply. It is quite ironic that Prozac, which is 94% fluoride and given to hyperactive children, requires a prescription from a licensed physician, while the same substance can be placed in our drinking water by dealers who have no medical training, no license to dispense medications, and no idea to whom they are administering this corrosive, toxic, and impairing substance. In 1946, Oscar Ewing, a Wall Street attorney and former counsel to the Aluminium Company of America, now known by the acronym ALCOA, was appointed by President Harry S. Truman to head the Federal Security Agency, which placed Ewing in charge of not only the U.S. Public Health Service but also the Social Security Administration of the Office of Education.
But then again, forced sterilization was not limited to Germany in the 1930s, and I think that's important to remember. There were forced sterilization laws and practices in a number of U.S. states, the Netherlands, and elsewhere in the 1930s at the same time. The Czechs practiced non-consensual sterilization on over 90,000 women from 1970 to 1990.
In China, we mentioned that in our one of our repro episodes that it was common in China as well. Yeah.
So while I'm continually horrified when studying the Holocaust, it's just as horrifying to remember that so much of what happens in the Nazi period that we deem unconscionable has happened or continues to happen in so many other places.